Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage, the podcast that works hard towards ascension, so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam. Did you ever go looking for something online and get lost? Mages have the same problem. The digital web is a large, strange place, and its shifting nature confuses mages of every faction. As a storyteller, figuring out the digital web is just as hard. I asked my guest today to help us put the pieces together. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Very excited to talk about the weird and fun place that is the digital web.
Sounds good to me. Well, James has been working on the Mage 20 SRD project. If you'd like to hear more about the Mage 20 SRD, listen to our recent community roundup episode. Stefan's team has been doing amazing work. As part of that team, James has practiced searching through Mage texts and distilling them down to present the needed facts. Those skills will benefit us today. James, how did you get started with Mage the Ascension?
A long time ago at this point, back in high school, the very first role playing game I ever played was Vampire the Masquerade with a group of friends. And as we explored the other World of Darkness products, the one that really drew us in, that got us very excited, was Mage. The weird possibilities, the interesting magic system, the creative and fun factions. There was just a lot of really cool stuff to play with there.
Well, today's episode started out with a suggestion from Jenna. She wanted to look at Digital Web 2.0 and see how well it aged. She became busy with other projects, but the discussion around the episode on our Discord server was active. James had a lot of good ideas and recently read through the books that touch on the digital web. I thought a discussion with him might be helpful to our listeners who are thinking about taking their players to the digital web. We are going to start off with the highlights of Mage books and then consider topics that would be useful to a storyteller trying to make sense of the digital web. Along the way, James will give us items a storyteller might want to consider, but also some commentary as a Mage fan. James, shall we get into it?
Yep, I'm ready to go.
Well, of our 5 books that we're taking a quick look at today, the first is Digital Web. Tell us about that.
It lays the groundwork for all of the concepts in the digital web. There's the basics that are going to carry through a lot of things, as well as a few things that fall off almost immediately after that book, and it's kind of a shame. You've got sort of the core structure of how the web works: sectors, conduits, digital entities, the different damage and paradox rules. It provides a lot of opportunities for stories to go into weird environments, but without the complications of getting into the Umbra, which can be a bit more complicated, especially for starting characters to find their way into. There's also a fun, weird culture already in place, and we kind of see that drop off as the books come out as well. But they've got a lot of terminology. There's a lot of personality built in to really make it clear how weird it is. And one of the things that makes it really fun is too many health levels, or on paradox becoming too serious of a concern, you tend to just get kicked off of the digital web. Or in the case of paradox, it all stays there when you leave. So you can really do a lot of magic, really go wild in a way. It's especially nice for groups that are really cautious and scared to cut loose, because as soon as they log out, everything resets and they're fine once again. For those that want to build a place in the digital web, it's got rules for formatting a sector right from the get-go in this first book. So it makes it really simple to build a place that is truly your own. And unlike a Horizon realm, it's something that you could feasibly do as starting characters instead of needing 5 dots in who knows how many spheres.
Well, my thoughts on the first digital web book: the writing was so good it made me want to take my games to the digital web. It made the place exciting. I agree the rules for handling things in the digital web need some improvement, but we don't need to toss them out completely. The artists contributing to this book were inspired by the movie Tron and the artwork on the sides of stand-up arcade machines, which still existed in the wild when this book came out. The digital web was depicted as a wild, fantastical place where artistic expression with a science fiction edge was a very real thing. But let's keep turning and look at Digital Web 2.0.
So Digital Web 2.0 brings in some meta plot elements, which is really exciting. For someone invested in the Mage meta plot, the Great Crash and it coinciding with the fall of Doisatep, this is a good point to sort of weave in that meta plot. You don't have to go to or interact with anyone from Doisatep for that to be relevant to your game if you're touching on the digital web. Later on, we're going to see that shift, and we'll talk about it when we get there. But it gives a way for your characters to really get directly involved with that aspect of the meta plot. It really, really expands the location types, which is a lot of fun. It adds some really cool new locations where you can set some additional types of stories. Haunts and Corrupted Web especially tie into the Great Crash, but aren't reliant on the Great Crash. So you can play with these weird new locations that have a lot of fun possibilities, whether you're dealing with the meta plot or not. There's a lot of improvements to navigation. So you've got hot links and popping, ways to get around much faster, and ways that feel more native to the internet, which is wonderful. It also introduces its own concept, which is the Great Race, where the virtual adepts and the void engineers are running around trying to find and secure all of the digital web. But unlike a lot of the conflict with the technocracy, this is something that is almost a friendly competition. They're both competing for this space, but they're not fighting tooth and nail and blowing each other up over it. So it's a fun way to pull in the idea that you can have technocrats out there that aren't a direct threat. You can interact with them and deal with them on a more friendly terms. It also really, really goes all in on the spy's demise, which is a very cool location in the digital web, but it is the almost only location that gets any time in 2.0. So there's tons and tons of information on it, but it feels like it's a single building in an empty city instead of a big expansive city that your characters can interact with. It makes the digital web feel really small with this one giant place inside of it. That has its ups and downs, but it is a cool location. There's a lot of cool ideas in that write up, so there's a lot of exciting stuff in 2.0.
Well, the second digital web book tried to make itself more grounded in real world internet technology. As a result, it looks more dated now than the first book, at least from my point of view. The systems give us some useful pieces, but I don't want to accept all of them as is. The visual depiction of the digital web for this book was taken from AAA video games of that time, which were trying for a photorealistic look. So basically, look out your window. You see that? That's what the digital web should look like, according to this book. As a result, the second book doesn't make me quite as excited to pull the digital web into my games. But let's keep moving. The first virtual adept tradition book.
So that book pulls in a lot of the cultural concepts that we talked about, the hacker culture and it being its own very distinct group of people interacting with the digital web. It introduces a really fun new system, which is Core Wars. So two virtual adepts build a virtual supercomputer and then write viruses and tweak them to try to take over it first. It's unfortunately very virtual adept or high technology use character focused, but it's also not super punishing. It has some fun and interesting drawbacks to losing without completely obliterating you. And notably, it's a non-violent conflict or competition, which is something that I find tends to lack a lot in tabletop RPGs, and Mage is unfortunately a lot of the time no exception. Having a way to come into conflict without needing to blow the other person up is always a fun thing to include. It also introduces the Crystal Palace, which I think gets mentioned here and there throughout other books, but never really gets dove into with too much depth. It does have a giant rote repository that can only be accessed by virtual adepts. So the idea of someone trying to pull a heist and steal from there, needing to do a favor to get access to it, or thwarting someone's scheme to try to destroy it gives you all sorts of opportunities for interesting stories.
I enjoyed this book because it took the hacker culture that was fading away when it was written and made it current for virtual adepts. That subculture had a lot of gameable potential, so I come back to this book for inspiration. Both virtual adept trad books are unofficial supplements for the digital web books. Some Mage fans don't know that, which makes a new digital web book a viable idea. Well, let's move on to the virtual adept tradition book revised.
The revised tradition book is interesting because this is where we see the meta plot retcon, sort of. And I think this has come up once or twice on the podcast before, where Doisotep falling and the Week of Nightmares, the Reckoning, initially are two very separate events, I think separated by a few years, if I'm not mistaken. But within the books written later, they kind of get compressed together. So there seems to be one great crash, one enormous whiteout that takes out the digital web temporarily. And the initial one that happened with Doisatep, and the later one that seems to be at the same time as the Avatar Storm, the Week of Reckoning, or sorry, the Week of Nightmares, are just combined into one event, which is a little weird, especially if you were playing through both of them. But you could have that as is for people playing after the fact. For people running games now, it's not a big concern. You don't need two different crashes. It's not going to make a big difference in your meta plot. Or alternatively, you can split them out and really look at the big shift that happens with the second one, and the fact that the first one is okay, this was a problem, we need to move on and rebuild. Whereas the second one, they go, well, maybe the digital web isn't viable to just leave reality and go there. We need to test ideas for reality 2.0 instead of the digital web being reality 2.0. The book also has, and I highly recommend for anyone interested in the digital web, read the opening fiction for the revised traditional book for virtual adepts. It is fascinating and jam packed full of ideas for the digital web. It has the concept of spaces inside of computers, kind of plays with the idea that hacking being abstracted as either computer roles, you could instead have characters physically doing things to make things happen within computers. Honestly, if you're going to run a game in the digital web, this book and either the first digital web or digital web 2.0 are probably the two best things you can put together to make that game happen with lots of interesting ideas.
The final book in our lineup was a section of the operative's dossier. Let's take a look at that.
So this one is a real mixed bag for me. There are some really, really fun ideas in there. And the idea of augmented reality is very interesting and creative and plays in with some modern technology that we're seeing continue to develop. But a lot of the rules in there do potentially cause more problems than give you opportunities. There is a really fun concept of sector ratings and kind of plays with the earlier ideas that we see of force and prime being very powerful and potentially dangerous within the digital web. But the big thing it brings towards the very end that contributes to the digital web is additional locations and the concept of the dark digital web. And I don't find either of those ideas very useful as is. They seem to be someone's notes turned into sentences and slapped at the end of the section in the book.
I remember there were a number of pieces of that write up in Operative's dossier that were not as useful to me, but the concept of augmented reality really got my interest, and that's why that's one of the topics we're going to get to once we reach that. And at this point, I'm so excited about getting into these topics that I think I'm just going to dive right in. Is that okay with you, James?
Yeah, yeah, please.
I thought it would be great to look at this from the point of view of a storyteller who is thinking about all the material that he or she has taken in on the digital web and then trying to ask, what can I use? What should I set aside? And what might I change or add to this mixture that's shaping up on the table in front of me to help me really bring this into my games? And along the way, some commentary would be most welcome. The first topic that I thought we would start with is where in the cosmology of Mage is the digital web actually located? When I started preparing for this episode, I had this information kind of lodged in my memory from the second edition Mage books, where they said that, to make a long story short, the digital web is one of the zones in the Umbra, which is one of those poorly understood, poorly defined spaces that shifts about and touches against the gauntlet, the high Umbra, the middle Umbra, and the low Umbra. And because of that, can be an interesting way to reach different places, but also any given location in a zone could actually change as that part of the zone shifts away from the low Umbra and gets closer to, say, the high Umbra. Now, when I brought this up, other Mage fans said, "Oh, don't you know it's over here, it's over there," and there were different answers popping up. And so, with James' encouragement, I looked into a bit, and there really is no solid answer that all of the editions agree upon for where is this digital web. When you consider the question, James, what comes to your mind?
The first digital web book is very, very clear that the digital web is inside of the gauntlet. And then no other book ever supports that and proceeds to contradict it as well. So there's a lot of opportunity here to kind of decide what makes the most sense for you. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff about the digital web, and where it's located is not necessarily the most important part. But there are a lot of things you can do depending on where you locate it. There's very different ways to tell very different stories depending on where you want to put it. So if you put it inside of the gauntlet, or if it's a separate realm from the Umbra, that creates some interesting implications that perhaps other realms like this exist. Perhaps there are entire places other than the various Umbrae and the digital web that you can go to. This could open that up for you to bring in some fun homebrew cosmology and make the wider setting of Mage very much your own. Or you could go the absolute opposite direction and say the digital web just exists stored on computers on the real internet, which has a lot of really fun implications for, if that's the case, then it's effectively stored on physical objects. And if things happen to the physical world where those objects are, what happens to the digital web? And vice versa, do things in the digital web do things to those physical objects? So if a server is shut down, does a sector go offline? And if people are inside of that sector, what happens to them when it's turned off? Personally, for me, my storytelling style is very much about just kind of throwing things out there for players to interact with and bounce off of, rather than having some sort of explicit end goal or big answer to the universe in mind. So, unless I had a player or a character that was extremely invested in where is the digital web, how does it work on a metaphysical level, I probably wouldn't even think about it for a chronicle unless I was trying to tell one of those stories that where the digital web is matters.
Yeah, I think it's easy to say that in the world of Mage, mages themselves disagree about exactly where it is, and it's a difficult thing to demonstrate. So there are a number of things in the supernatural world that are going to be mysterious, and that really is fine. A lot of people would say that's even appropriate. When I look at the digital web, I would agree with James that if you have a game that centers on the digital web, that is all about how the digital web is going to change from this state to that state, or if some earth shaking realization comes out about the digital web that changes everything, then it's a good idea for the storyteller to have a sense of where is the digital web actually, because that will have some effects. But if, like most people, you're going to do some cool stuff in the digital web and then go somewhere else and do some cool stuff there, it doesn't matter so much where it is, to be honest. The first book says it's inside of the gauntlet, and the effect that has on games is that is a good justification for how easily mages on Earth can get into the digital web. It's not as hard as getting into the Umbra. And when you look at the rule systems, that backs that up. That makes sense. And it says that you can get out of the digital web and go to other places in the Umbra. So if it is inside the gauntlet, then getting to the other side of the gauntlet, the near Umbra, actually kind of makes some sense there. And so I get that. Now, the problem is, it says in the first digital, actually in both digital web books, it says the digital web is a good way to get to dystopia in the middle Umbra. And if it is located inside the gauntlet, that becomes more difficult to explain. If you take the later second edition approach and say the digital web is either a zone or much like one, then that is a good justification for saying how people can jump the wall at certain points in the digital web and get out into the middle Umbra or even the low Umbra. That makes sense. But now what you have trouble explaining is, how is it so easy for mages on Earth to access the digital web if it's on clear on the other side of the gauntlet as a zone floating through the near Umbra? You need to have some sort of idea. It's like, well, how do you get there so easily? What makes this an exception? So there's gotchas either way. And as James said, a storyteller doesn't need to understand the metaphysics of the digital web to bring it into her game and have a great time with it. And this is just a good place to say that the story going around that the digital web is actually on in a server room in New Jersey, that is a lie. That is just completely false. I don't know where people are picking that up, but we just need to plug that one right now. So moving right along, let's take a look at locations inside of the digital web.
There's a lot of fun, not just locations, but location types within the digital web. And what you wind up using is really going to vary based on your needs and interests for the story or stories that you're trying to tell throughout your chronicle. If you want something that gives the vibes of a high tension spy thriller with clandestine meetings with technocrat contacts, or maybe even a Romeo and Juliet type situation where someone's character and a technocrat NPC have some sort of illicit romance, Spy's Demise is a fantastic location. I'm gonna talk, I'm sure, at least a couple more times about how I think Spy's Demise is way too overdeveloped and used, but it has a lot of cool potential, especially if you do constrain it to that it's a safe meeting ground. The lore behind it has always been that mages, technocrats, even sleepers, if they can find their way there, are all welcome and no violence is permitted. So it's a really excellent location to make meetings happen that no one would feel safe having otherwise.
I was just going to chime in here and say that the spy's demise is unique not only in the digital web, but in the entire Mage setting as a neutral ground where technocrats and non technocrats basically can talk to each other with very little fear of consequences because there are mysterious and powerful forces supposedly that operate the spy's demise and they make sure that it remains a neutral ground. But also, it's just the nature of the digital web. If, for example, someone were to pull in a very powerful wonder into the spy's demise and say, haha, now I can just do whatever I like. And they start swatting people. Well, the worst that happens is those people are pushed offline. They're back in their living room and they say, okay, well, I'll just log in tomorrow and say some snarky remark about this guy. And so saying that the spy's demise is a neutral ground, it is constructed very well. It is set up very well to do that. And so, yeah, it is a unique spot in all of the mage setting. But I'm sorry, go on, James.
There's also a lot of potential to explore some of the really weird edges of reality, how things can get extremely strange, and what it's like to interact with them, what you can make happen as a result of them. Corrupted Web and Haunts, I mentioned before. Corrupted Web are distorted and warped by the whiteout or the Great Crash. So there's all sorts of things that just don't work right there. There are potentially mages, and whether it's their consciousness or their avatar or some other aspect of them that's trapped within, are there. Haunts are kind of in a similar vein. You have digital ghosts of some sort. There's also some implication that they're where the digital web crosses over with the Shadowlands, so wraiths can wander through. There's a lot of fun things you can do with those and really kind of look at how strange things can get. There's also a lot of other fun things you can play with if you want to do dangerous infiltration missions into enemy territory. There's TechnoTurf or the servers, which I feel like I have to say funny because the way it's written in all caps with like 4 or 5 letters. You can look at the consequences of overreaching and losing yourself to the digital web. One of the locations that I really love is the Crater, which was created by a mage sort of succeeding at formatting a location, but their avatar becoming embedded within it, and presumably they died in the process. The location itself is just a bunch of combat arenas, so mixed bag on how interesting that is for your story, but the implications of the crater are incredible. A few other locations that are really fun to touch on are the Seer, which in a lot of ways is sort of the Internet Archive or Wayback Machine of the digital web. It's a giant repository of a lot of the things that were lost in the Great Crash. And from the opening fiction in the second digital web book, 2.0, the Fishbowl is a fun little sector that really looks at how strange things can be. It is a literal fishbowl where all characters within are required to use icons that are fish and swim around to talk to each other. So, a strange little meeting ground slash chat room that you can play in. For all those, though, I think that personally the most exciting part of the digital web is the ease of including your own locations. So, detailing out the rules of a sector, the parameters according to the first digital web book, and letting the players discover and push against those parameters as they try to do something there is really appealing to me as a storyteller. So, in the rest of Mage, there's only so much you can warp things outside of the Umbra and Umbral realms. And even then, you're not going to have your player characters running around as dinosaurs or floating around as fish. There's a strong limit on what's really feasible. So, having these really wild locations where characters can go all in on strange and interesting ideas is fun and exciting. The operatives dossier touches on changing ratings, but at that point, the idea of parameters is completely lost, which is a big shame, I think. The parameters are sort of the definition of how a sector works within the digital web. So, what magic is or isn't vulgar, how easy it is or isn't to pop to someone else, if people can fly, if walls are solid, if gravity points down or even exists at all. There's a lot of things you can do with the rules of these locations that, unlike, well, I don't want to say unlike reality, because magic and mage is pretty open ended, but unlike reality, without five dots, you can interact with these rules and change them in a way that lets you really play with reality itself. So you could turn off gravity. You could, for those of us who played first person shooters back in the 90s, the idea of no clipping and just all walls are no longer solid, you can now walk through all of them, is something that you can do in the digital web, even as starting characters, and gives you a chance to really have some fun.
I think that wraps it up for locations, but I would like to hear about native residents. That means things that live in the digital web and always did and are likely to stay there.
So there's a lot of interesting things in the digital web, and that's true for everywhere in Mage. Really, you don't have to have the digital web to throw scary monsters and creatures at your players. But if that is something you'd like to do, it is a fantastic excuse to just completely perfectly copy something out of a video game on purpose and throw it at your players and make them deal with it. There's also some really fun ideas that come up in a few of the books, such as the concept of AIs, artificial intelligences, with awakened avatars, which has all sorts of wild implications for the way avatars, magic, ascension, the very nature of who can even have an avatar, all of a sudden opens up these possibilities for different stories you can tell, ideas you can explore, and ideas that your player characters can explore and really get into. There's a lot of mileage you can get out of looking at these concepts. There are some other fun ones. One of the ones that really stuck with me are lost programs, the idea of digital entities that are stuck in a loop of sorts, and when their request is satisfied, they vanish. So, very similar to the classic idea of ghosts, they have some unfinished business. But they're very explicitly not ghosts, they're their own weird little digital entities. So, what are they? What were they? Where do they go when their request is satisfied? And having, say, one of them haunt a player character and follow them around asking for some weird request to be fulfilled is a fun little idea for a story or a side quest of sorts for players to engage with.
When I was preparing for this episode, I had this idea. I was thinking, the old expression, herding cats, trying to get a lot of people or animals of some sort that are really very likely to wander off on their own, but yet you still have to keep them all together to accomplish something. I thought it would be interesting if there was some brilliant mage who created a brilliant rote or automatic system of some sort, and then he broke it up into pieces, and then he took each piece and then programmed it as if it was like virus or a data beast or something like that. And so you have the first piece is this weird little entity that whatever box you put it in, it chews a hole in the box and falls out and wanders off. And then the second piece is highly electric. Anything that comes anywhere near it is going to get a serious electrical shock. And then, the third has a different complication. The fourth has a different complication. So you make, like, I don't know, 6 or 7 of these pieces, and you tell the players you've got to get control of all 7 of them, and then get them all together. And each one is a pain in the butt all on its own, and this all has to be done in the digital web. And every time one of them zaps you, you've got to log in again and find out, okay, how much time passed, where is everything. I don't know, it might be fun. It's a possibility, but do go on.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good time. A lot of fun could be had with something like that, having to track all those down. Outside of that, there are NPCs, as it were, programs that are in the digital web and running. We get the idea of at least a couple of them with the Spy's Demise. I don't know that I have any fantastic advice on exactly how to use those. There's a lot of different directions you can take it, whether all of them are secretly actually AIs that are doing things on their own time, or whether they really are just simple little user facing programs. It's similar to the location of the digital web. It's one of those things that if you're not worried about diving deep into it, you don't need to worry about the nature of it. You can treat them as NPCs in video games and just they're there, they deliver a message, they repeat the message every time the characters ask and move on with it.
Artificial intelligences were talked about in each book that touches on the digital web, especially the 2 books with the title Digital Web. And when they were written, AI was not a controversial topic. It was a science fiction idea. It was something pulled out of old movies and old science fiction stories. And so it got thrown into the mix, and it didn't cause a splash at the time. Now, we're recording this in 2025, and everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. People have strong feelings about it, strong opinions about where it will or will not go in the future. And so if that is interesting to you, you can pull it into your game. As a longtime Mage fan, I think of the fact that in every edition of Mage, the sphere of mind at level 5 allows a mage of any faction to create a mind. And so it seems only natural that techno mages would want to make a computer program that can think as well as a mind. And so this idea that there are mages out there using Mind 5 to make something a lot like a mind or a personality, and then put it on the digital web, wind it up and let it go. It doesn't seem so controversial for me as a Mage fan, but your mileage may vary.
Yeah, I think it is being here in 2025 a complicated topic to approach at all. It's something that you can potentially have a lot of fun in games with, but the AI of today, the chatbots and the like, I haven't seen anything that makes them look more than glorified predictive text engines to me. And whether or not that's something you agree on, that's fine. But the concept of those existing alongside human intelligence entities that are native creatures to the digital web, those two bouncing off of each other and interacting, and where do you draw the line between the two? That is something you could get a lot of benefit out of in a chronicle, regardless of your personal opinions on modern AI versus the fantasy AI of
Yeah, I
Mage.
like how you put that. It's like taking some of the best out of the speculative science fiction and saying, hey, we could pull this into our game and have some fun with it. I think we've covered the topic of native residents. Next, we move on to icons, which we understand in the real world. But in the world of Mage, icon is what you look like in the digital web. So a lot of people just assume that when you go to the digital web and you're there and other people there look at you, you look like yourself, right? Well, not necessarily. You can use a little bit of coding, a little bit of sphere knowledge to make yourself look like whatever you like. So, James, tell us about that.
I'm going to start a bit by speaking poorly of the digital web content in the various books, which I hate to do because I love them and there's a lot of fun ideas. But I think the concept of icons is critically underused in the digital web books. There is a lot of ink and a lot of time spent just sort of treating them as vehicles for power fantasies. There's the potential there for PCs to really be whoever they are, explore who they are. For example, I have a player in my current chronicle that is a kinfolk, and their concept hinges around the fact that they always expected to be and wanted to be a werewolf and are disappointed in being a mage instead. So being able to log into the digital web, have their existence be a werewolf in form, if not entirely in function, was huge for that character. And the role playing that came out of the highs of being in the digital web, finally being a werewolf, and the lows of logging back out and being just human again was really awesome to have at the table. I guess if we move on to the topic of function, there's a lot of opportunity here as well. Icons are just your presence in the web within the digital web books, but they only change appearance and intimidation, which seems restrictive to me. Why can't search functions and knowledge databases supplement knowledges of a character? Why can't you build functionality into an icon such as a dragon icon breathing fire or flying, especially if you're in a fantasy themed sector where that makes sense to be able to do? It's a chance to really let players cut loose, or alternatively, let them really lean into a theme and get rewarded for it and have some additional capabilities beyond what they're normally able to do. Physical stats are normally brought in as your mental stats, or alternatively, if you're holistically immersed, just your regular physical stats. But it would be very cool, and I think make a lot of sense if you could code physical stats into your icon. When using icons, I think one of the things that the books forget is to remind you to have a separate health and paradox track. The huge part of the digital web is the fact that when you lose all of your health, you don't even necessarily get kicked out of the digital web. If you're in a public, safe sector that isn't restricted, you just get popped outside of the sector and your icon reforms right there. So your health going down to zero just results in a pop. It's not a big deal. Paradox is in a similar boat. The moment you log out, all of that paradox is dumped. So it makes the digital web, I think I mentioned earlier, a very safe place to explore and cut loose with magic and just go wild. There is a little more bookkeeping, but if you have a separate health and paradox track, you're not going to get confused with what's currently on your character sheet and can easily wipe the slate and reset it as appropriate. For holistic immersion, your icon is your physical body, and I think that's a bit silly. There are a lot of ideas in the books themselves that make it a bit silly to ever go in with your physical body. Hacking in 2.0, and that gets expanded in the operatives dossier, comes to mind, where you're physically doing things within the web, but it's just a representation of your finding access points, making computer roles, essentially. There's not a good reason to force players to put themselves into this danger. The books talk about the benefits of you get your physical stats as your physical stats, but I can't see anyone having enough dots in their physical stats that when you hard derez, you die instead of getting logged off. It doesn't seem like a great trade off to me.
Yeah, with holistic immersion, a person looking at the three ways of entering into the digital web might casually get this impression that there are three ways. They're all equally valid. Some have advantages over others, but in the end, they're all just as good as each other. And as a Mage fan who's read the books and spent some time thinking these things over, I'm not certain that was the original intention. I think the original intention was let's see, I don't have a list in front of me. So sensory, astral, and then holistic. Holistic is like on the movie Tron, towards the beginning, the hero gets zapped with a special super high tech machine, and he's no longer in the physical world. His mind, his body, his soul, all of them go together into the digital world. And if he dies, he's really dead. That's holistic. And I got the impression that holistic was the clumsy workaround for the people who didn't really get the point of the digital web. I think sensory immersion is the sort of the newbie low risk way of getting in. It's not as good as astral immersion, but it is easier, it's lower risk, it's simple, there's no learning curve. And so it makes sense for newbies and people who are not well equipped. But when it comes to holistic, I think the idea is the astral immersion is the ideal way to get in, and the people who are going to make the most of the digital web and take only reasonable risks without taking high risks, it's those astral guys. They're the ones who kind of get it. As whereas holistic, it's a tremendous advantage for werewolves and other were creatures. I mean, it makes them just as much of a danger on the digital web as it does on Earth, and whether or not that's a good thing is a matter of opinion. But getting back to mages and sleepers and regular humans, a really strong, really athletic guy would get a moderate advantage by going in holistic. But I think the joke would be on him because he takes such very high risks that I think it would be kind of foolish for the athlete to let himself get talked into the holistic immersion. It's like, yeah, you have some advantages, but you didn't know that you were taking much higher risks than was reasonable for you to take. So that skinny, scrawny guy who went in as an astral immersion, guess what? He's still got an advantage over you. I'm sorry, this just isn't your day. So that's kind of my approach to the three ways of entering in, but your mileage may vary.
I think one last thing before we move on, especially since we're talking about icons at the moment, is something you can do with holistic immersion to make it interesting, to make it relevant, is either allow holistic users to wrap themselves in an icon. There's a lot of talk throughout the books about how icons are created from a program, and there's really no sensible reason you couldn't run that program even as a holistically immersed user. So give them that layer, make things a bit safer for them, give them the benefits without the massive drawbacks. Or alternatively, if you want to get really wild and weird with it, since their icon is their self, after multiple visits and consistently playing with their icon body as a holistically immersed user, you could start bleeding some of those changes back to their physical form.
Ooh, devious.
Yeah, there's a lot of dangers with that, and it does start getting into the real weird, hard to exist in the modern normal world with big horns on your head, that kind of thing. But it does open up some fun avenues for playing around with the idea, making that icon valuable for the holistically immersed user instead of just I'm me and I'm on the internet now.
I like that idea of the athletic guy is going to say, yeah, well, I get a benefit from this, so I'll just take some risk. And then you introduce this new idea of if you are holistically immersed and you do it repeatedly, then your physical body on Earth is going to get an effect from that you were not warned about. You should be careful when doing this sort of thing. And the astrally immersed guy, he just doesn't have to worry about this. So that is something that was not even suggested in any of the Mage books. But now that you tell me about it, it's like, that's an idea I would love to play with. Well, let's move on to our next topic, and that is magic, which is, long story short, when mages go to the digital web, they still have their sphere knowledge and they can use it there, but the digital web is not exactly like Earth. So, what's different? What does that mean? What can you tell us about that, James?
I think we need to start out with the big caveat that digital web metaphysics are weird. It is a very strange, wild realm that does not work in the same way as Earth. The books are pretty clear that everything there is built out of forces. So this has, similar to when you're in the Umbra and everything is impacted by the spirit sphere, everything in the digital web can be interacted with or manipulated via the forces sphere. The books do open up that you can use life and matter on things that were pulled into the digital web, be that objects or people, via holistic immersion, or I think the virtual adept wrote is either encoding or encrypting to put objects into the digital web. But even if you have those, you're not limited to that. Forces and data, if you're using that sphere, are available to manipulate things throughout the entire web. One of the things that the books touch on accidentally via a rote is the idea of using entropy to manipulate things. You can't necessarily manipulate them in a controlled way, but scrambling data and randomizing the ones and zeros could potentially have a huge impact on things within the digital web. It may all be built out of forces, but at the end of the day, those forces represent digital constructs. There's also the concept that gets touched on a little bit that this is a realm of correspondence. So it's built out of forces, but is it built out of forces in a realm where correspondence is the underlying substrate? Can you get some real big bang for your buck via the correspondence sphere, perhaps? That's one of those things you might have to answer on your own. And the other really fun one that comes up is prime and forces being extremely strong to the point of dangerous within the digital web. Getting successes over the rating of a location results in accumulating paradox. I believe that was Operative's dossier where that really got kind of pinned down, and the manipulation of ratings up and down is in there. But outside of war zones, that concept exists from Digital Web 2.0 and on, where very powerful forces or prime effects, even ones where you accidentally just roll too many successes, are going to cause paradox to happen and potentially induce a whiteout. Within this weird digital realm, in a way that you're not in the real world, sort of encouraged to play with the nature of it. The rules of reality, or more specifically, the rules of sectors you're within, are exposed. They are rules that someone else has constructed and placed when they formatted the sector. And as a result, you can use magic to change them. So, magic in the digital web has this very direct implication that you can play with the very rules of the worlds that you're in. And that's huge. We're talking about a place where it makes sense for starting level characters, for beginning just rolled up mages, to wield effects that are absolutely impossible in meat space. One other thing worth mentioning, the books talk about having boosted sphere levels in the digital web. It comes up in, I believe, 2.0. I'd have to go double check, but especially comes up in Operative's dossier, where multiple spheres get a +1 to them. And I would caution storytellers to really consider if that makes any sense for the world they're trying to convey. It's cool to have extra power. It's great to have more capability, but spheres have been classically considered these realms of knowledge. It's not just that you have this raw power. Arete represents that a little more directly. It's that you understand something on a level where you can manipulate it in a supernatural way. And giving people random +1s to various spheres implies that either they have extra knowledge somehow suddenly now, or that it's not actually about knowledge, that it really is just about power. In which case, why does it take so long to learn new levels of a sphere? It's not D&D. You can't just hand out bonus spells. Magic is a fundamental concept to Mage, and understanding magic is a huge part of each character's journey to grow and potentially pursue ascension. So, that being said, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily consistent from mage book to mage book anyway. So, do you want to use it? Do you want to pass out those +1s, let people go a little wild? That might be a ton of fun.
I remember reading the first digital web book a while back for the Tomes of Magic episode, and at the time, the definition of how the spheres work differently in the digital web, I guess it didn't register with me very strongly. I just liked the idea of some things being easier. Preparing for this episode, I went through in the first digital web book, read that again, and it said every mage who goes to the digital web, their dots in the correspondence sphere, it's just one higher than it was before, with a ceiling of 5. If you have a 5, you're going to stay at 5, but other than that, it's just one level higher than it was before you got there. And I have to agree with James. I find that very, very difficult to justify. Thinking back to the first edition Mage book, the idea of sphere ratings for a realm, the idea with that was, if you go to a realm that has mind +2, That means if you know the mind sphere at the level 2 before you get there, then you can do mind effects at level 1 or level 2, and it's a skill roll. You don't have to roll arete. You cannot get paradox, and so there's more of a freedom. You're free to do it more without so much supernatural risk. But for the first time with the digital web book, you get this idea that your knowledge in a sphere is one higher than it was before you got there. I have a hard time justifying that. I don't understand how a mage knows things that they didn't know before they got there. And I think they wanted to justify the fact that when somebody's on the internet, they can search for information and get it really quickly. And so, wouldn't it be cool to kind of carry that over for mages? It's like, oh, the correspondence sphere level 1, spatial sensory perceptions. Well, all the mages can do that because it's kind of like doing a search on the internet. You just got that information. It's like, well, okay, I guess that sounds cool. But as James so aptly pointed out, the other add on effects that come from that, I don't think it's worth it. I don't recommend it. I would not want to do that in my games. If a certain sphere is easier, then yeah, make it not a required arete roll. Or when they roll their arete to do an effect for that sphere, just give them one more success or something like that. There are better ways to express this idea of it's easier here or it's more prevalent here. And just before we move on, James talked about the idea that if in the digital web, the prime and the forces sphere, they're really potent forces there. So if you get more successes than you planned on, even though you did everything right, you're going to get paradox as a sort of, it's not meant to be a penalty. It's just a natural effect of being in a place where there are strong forces at work. And guess what? You just poked the bear. So even though you got what you want, you got an unintended consequence for that. I think that's interesting. I like that. But there is another possibility there, and that is if the forces and prime sphere are very powerful here, then you could say as a storyteller, if the player gets more than 2 or 3 successes, then the effect, it's accidentally overpowered. They get an unintended consequence. Not paradox, but instead of just making the object come down, you make every object within the visible distance, all of it comes down. And so all those islands in the sky in that sector you just got to, they all hit the floor. And suddenly a whole lot of people notice you, and they're not very happy. So paradox is not the only unintended consequence. You can't just have overpowered, unexpected effects. But anyways, James, do you think we've covered the topic of magic?
I really like that concept of powers accidentally going out of control. One of the things that really appeals to me with Mage is how weird magic can get with paradox and resonance and that sort of thing. So, effects that accidentally spiral out beyond what you intended sounds like a ton of fun. One last thing I want to mention that honestly I just thought of while we were talking about this, with the +1 to spheres, a real easy way to represent how much easier those spheres are. I believe it's correspondence forces and might be prime. I could be wrong about that. But instead of granting bonus ranks in the spheres, just subtract 1 from the difficulty of all effects being done with those spheres. It still makes it clear that they're different, that they're more potent, but doesn't have implications for the very concept of what it is to know a rank of a sphere.
I could totally get behind that. Well, our next topic is getting in, which means people on Earth who want to get to the digital web. How hard is it? How can they do it? And what effect does that have on them once they arrive?
This is one of the parts that's really exciting about the digital web for me because unlike the Umbra, getting into the digital web is easy. You can just have sensory visitation, which is so simple that a sleeper can do it as long as they have the right gear. It is limiting, so you aren't as powerful when you're in the digital web. You're suffering from a increased difficulty to your rolls, but it's also very safe. So if you have a character or player that is extremely worried about going to this weird realm, it's a very, very easy way to get in, interact with the digital web, but not have to worry about the potential dangers that it could impose. It's not clearly stated, except for the weird augmented reality access, but it would probably make sense for anyone going in through sensory visitation to be immune to icon death and chaos dumps. Those are big scary things that can happen. They're not necessarily death for a character, but especially with chaos dumps, they're more or less as good as it. The huge drawbacks of, I believe it's +2 difficulty on every roll, seems like a good trade-off for immunity from those dangerous occurrences. Astral immersion is the next level up. And this one, I think, is, as you mentioned earlier, the ideal way to access the digital web. You are fully capable while you're there, but a hard derez in TechnoTurf isn't going to blow you up, and that's the end of you forever. It is a little more demanding. The requirement is a correspondence to effect, which moves your consciousness or your perceptions into the digital web, and that's how you genuinely wind up there. And I don't see any reason you couldn't easily have that effect built into the rig that's being used by the players, whether that's something they've purchased as a wonder or something that someone else is lending them the use of. There doesn't need to be an enormous sphere tax or some huge favor from someone to be able to get in there. It's only a rank 2 effect. It's not a big deal. Alternatively, you could let them touch on things with sensory visitation, but be very limited. And then now they have a bunch of things they want to do or need to do in the digital web, and they need to do some favors to get those rigs that they want for astral immersion. For holistic immersion, I think we already covered that a lot. In a lot of ways, it's a holdover from Tron. It's that idea that you're physically going in there, but it's so risky. I think there are situations where it could be fun within a story. You're in a technocratic base and there's no way to escape, so you holistically immerse yourselves and then need to find a way to log out into the Umbra. There's potential for storytelling stuff with holistic immersion that doesn't exist with sensory visitation and astral immersion, but you would want to make sure that that's the intent, or that's something that you're more or less forcing the situation on the players, or opening up that opportunity for them, not making it their only real avenue for access for normal day to day or an extended chronicle within the digital web. And there is one last way to get into the digital web, which is pretty weird. It's popular with werewolves, less so with mages, which is web climbing, where you climb the pattern web and find yourself inside the digital web. It's a fun idea. It's cool that it exists. It creates some fun setting implications as far as the pattern web and the digital web and the Umbra and how all of those things interconnect. But unless the reverse of that technocratic situation, if you're in the Umbra being pursued by something and web climbing is your best escape, that could be a fun, interesting idea. But I don't see web climbing being a way any characters would want to go into the digital web on purpose. It's nice that it's there. I don't know that I'd ever use it in a game.
Well, we've already touched on it, but let's talk about moving around in the digital web. And that means after someone gets there, the internet is vast, as everyone says. If you're walking, how much of that can you cover? Well, walking and running is not the only way to get around in the digital web. So, James can tell us more.
How moving around between sectors in the digital web works is drastically different between which version of the digital web you're using. The very early version, it's a series of tubes. As we all know, the internet truly is. It's a bunch of tubes and it connects everything together. And that's it. With Digital Web 2.0, it opens that up, but I think 2.0 did it in a slightly complicated, maybe almost problematic way for it being usable, which is that there's not a clear distinction between conduits and sectors. So in the initial digital web, you hit a conduit, you zoom to the other end, you're in a different sector. In 2.0, conduits are places with their own features and side rooms and things going on. And by the time you get to the operatives dossier write up, conduits are handled in a few different ways. So yes, there's tubes, but there's also liminal spaces. There's streets and alleys and winding passageways that could lead you to sectors or could lead to you being lost. I think that operatives dossier write up is a great way to represent it, in that there are places where you're going to be able to get right from one spot to another. There's other places where you're wandering around almost aimlessly trying to understand where you need to go. It does make it a little more like the Umbra, but I don't think that's a bad thing. A lot of times the journey can be just as interesting as the destination.
So a sector is a place where there's you can meet people and there are things going on, and a conduit was just like a hallway between sectors, is like a hallway between rooms. Don't expect to meet anyone interesting or do anything interesting in the hallway. It's just getting you from room 1 to room 2. But as published material came out more and more, the hallways started getting wider and there's furniture in them and there's people hanging out there, and it seems like they sort of morphed into sectors of their own. Or am I getting that wrong?
No, I think you're right. And I think in a fun way that can represent the growth of the complexity of the digital web. Like the internet, it has grown and evolved and things have been added to it. So conduits growing into these new things, in some cases, maybe not all of them, I'm sure there are still lots of conduits out there, opens up this opportunity for more and more places, more and more weirdness. And it's a direct representation of that growth and change over time. The digital web is a psychoreactive location. We'll be talking about this when we get to the idea of formatting and Virgin Web, but the digital web in its raw form represents what's within people's minds. So as people are zooming through these conduits over and over, them being there is going to have an impact on the locations they're moving through.
And that can play into the idea of resonance back on Earth in Mage, which opens up interesting possibilities. Before we move on to the next section, was there anything we didn't cover on moving around in the digital web?
Digital Web 2.0 introduced the idea of hotlinks and popping. Hotlinks are instant warps to specific locations in the same or other sectors. And I am a giant fan of these. It makes the digital web feel like the internet in a good way. The digital web, it's this powerful magic realm, and it shouldn't be more restrictive to use than the actual internet. That doesn't feel good. So with hotlinks, you introduce the idea that you can just click on this hotlink and it will instantly take you to where you need to go. It could take you to an entrance to a place, say you need to load a specific icon, or it could take you right into where you need to be. I think that hotlinks and popping, which is the correspondence teleporting equivalent of those, really open up transportation in the digital web to enjoy the conveniences of the internet.
Hot links and popping, was that digital web 2.0 where that was introduced, or was it Operatives Dossier?
Digital Web 2.0 was where they first brought that in.
Okay, so that's where people can get more about that. Well, next up is creating sectors and Virgin Web, and we have discussed this before. Creating sectors is when you've seen enough of other people's sectors, you want to make one of your own. You don't have to be an archmage to do it. Virgin Web is basically an empty server in the real world. Once you make some files and put some websites and applications there, it's no longer empty. Well, that's the idea of Virgin Web. It's a place in the digital web where no one put anything there yet, but you can be the first.
The first digital web book treats it as a fairly simple process, but not without danger. So, a completely fumbled or botched formatting attempt could kill a character and, well, not necessarily kill a character, but potentially embed them within the sector itself. So, they're not going to be able to operate outside of the digital web. They are part of the place they've built. The first book treated what you could set for parameters as being capped or affected by your spheres. So you can't create a realm that works completely different from sort of your base understanding of reality without the appropriate spheres to do it. But just building your own sector in the digital web really only involved spending willpower and rolling arete. So anyone could do it. Digital Web 2.0 made it a little bit more complicated, a little tougher to do. You now need computer technology or computer hacking at 4, and the difficulty and required successes go up very quickly based on the size. If you're adding constraints, there's no direct concept of parameters, so it doesn't really make it clear how to fine tune your sector. And then the difficulty, even without the idea of separate and specific parameters, for something beyond a small room, goes up very quickly and makes it tough for characters to format a sector of their own. But really, your best bet is probably to treat formatting a sector of Virgin Web as a story beat, not a bunch of roles. You need to keep in mind that there is a consequence to having a sector and upkeeping it, similar to a chantry or a sanctum. I know Terry once talked about how when you get a void ship, you now have a mage game that is about having a void ship. And where you go, how you maintain it, all that really revolves around that possession. And a sector is going to wind up being very similar. You need to maintain it, you need to defend it, you are potentially going to want to enhance it. These are all major story aspects that are now going to come up again and again. And sure, you could ignore all of that and just have a sector that's floating out in the digital web, but if you're going to go through the trouble of finding Virgin Web, which is very much played up as a rare resource, and build it into a sector that fulfills all your wildest dreams, it seems a little silly to just leave and never use it or interact with it again. That being said, if your characters are finding a chunk of Virgin Web, there is incredible value in that. And offering it up to a powerful virtual adept who knows their way around, perhaps they'd be willing to cordon off a little section for you and provide those defenses for you. The idea of having and building and maintaining a sector is really where we see a strong divide between the digital web users that are there to interact and do things and go places, and the digital web users that are making it their home and building it into the world they want it to be.
That plays into an idea you and I were discussing before we started recording, and that was probably more than half of the people who go to the digital web are more like visitors. They go there, they find entertainment, they gather information, they meet people, but they don't change the nature of the digital web. They just go there and see what's there and use it as someone else set it up. But then you've got this other, perhaps you could call them elite class, that's less than 50% of the people on there. They really understand the digital web. They have stakes in it. They not only go there and look around and talk to people, but they actually change parts of it. They make it their own, and they have a deeper understanding of what makes up the digital web. And so that's an interesting dynamic to bring into games placed there.
I think this is the who owns sectors, what do they do, how do they work, is a great place to explore that idea of the digital web visitors and tourists versus the people or characters who are genuinely invested in it.
Does that about sum it up for creating sectors in Virgin Web?
Yep.
Then let's talk about damage in combat, which is basically if somebody attacks you, can they? And does it hurt?
And I think it's worth mentioning this before I go into the other details. I want to say one of the books, and I am struggling to remember which one, they mention the concept that people who are on the digital web via sensory visitation can only interact with other icons and things within the digital web by using rotes. I think that's a little far fetched. I think it's going to make it very hard for anyone to do anything. So I'm just going to kind of skim past that one. As I recall, it only comes up in one of the books anyway. So if anyone out there is thinking, oh, but you didn't talk about this, well, now I have, and I don't want to talk about it. So we'll move on.
I can see that.
Damage and combat in the digital web are by and large treated the same as damage and combat everywhere else. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It keeps it simple, but it doesn't communicate that there are unique and interesting things about the digital web. So, just at a basic level, like I mentioned before, tracking your health levels separately in the digital web is going to be a good idea since when they fill up in a safe sector, you're going to pop outside of it. When they fill up in a restricted sector, you're going to start looking at a hard derez and potentially get kicked off the digital web. Even then, you're coming out most likely with a headache, not with a hole blown through you as your icon may have just had. So you can just treat it as normal combat without death as the consequence. It's not a huge threat. But you can also take a different approach. You can open up concepts like healing or even doing damage with the computer skill or hacking or technology as well as other means. You can also have opponents who are weaponizing that forces and prime potency that we talked about before. So, if building up a ton of paradox via powerful forces and prime effects is dangerous, that's dangerous to everyone. Unlike normal paradox in meat space, the whiteout effect that happens when there's a paradox backlash on the digital web often affects everyone around you, potentially the entire sector itself. So enemies could intentionally show up in what is normally a safe sector and start throwing extremely powerful effects with the intention of causing a whiteout because now it is extremely dangerous. You can also really play with the idea of soft derez versus hard derez. With a soft derez, you're just kicked out of a sector, but with a hard derez, you get kicked back to your chair and need to take a moment to recover, log back in, potentially have some penalties to your mental stats for a length of time. And playing with the difference between those two is a fun way to sort of underscore that unique nature of the digital web. Getting blown up in a safe sector out of the blue is annoying, not, well, roll new characters. There's a lot of flexibility for what is or isn't vulgar, what is or isn't even viable. So there's a lot of ways you can play around with dangerous situations in the digital web and do things very differently from back in hamburger country.
Next up, we get to a new concept as of Operatives Dossier. So, the Mage 20, fourth edition of Mage, introduced this idea of augmented reality, which was a new thing for the digital web and got a lot of people talking. James, can you tell us more about it?
Augmented reality is a little tricky to talk about at first, so we'll have to sort of set the ground rules of what we're talking about. There are more or less two different ideas presented in the book. One of the digital web bleeding into and overlapping with meat space. So there are augmented reality sectors you can interact with while logged in, and objects within them that provide information are able to do things. Or there's the idea that all of this is happening in sectors in the digital web itself while you're also walking around in meat space. I think that second concept, while it seems like that's what it's mostly written about, is confusing and problematic and just conjures up the idea of people wandering around with augmented reality headsets on, bumping into things instead of sitting in their chairs and getting things done. So I'm going to come at this, this is largely thanks to you talking me through it and giving me some of your ideas on it. Looking at augmented reality as there are a whole bunch of layered sectors that are on top of physical space, and you can log into different ones and bounce between them, and objects within them only exist within that sector. So you could have a technocratic construct with a monitor, some sort of augmented reality object or simple AI, simple digital creature that is monitoring for anyone trying to sneak in or break in that's not supposed to be there. A virtual adept doesn't know the sector exists to log into it. So even if they're connected to augmented reality, they're not going to see this object. They're not going to interact with it, but the object can see them and could fire off a warning that someone is physically invading this construct. There's a lot of fun potential with that. The idea of things being hidden in plain sight, be it caches of information, digital objects, digital entities. You can do a lot of really cool things with these layered augmented reality sectors. You could have an entire location jam packed with augmented reality objects that finding out that that augmented reality sector exists so you can get to them, interact with them, benefit from them, or affect them. There's a lot of fun story stuff you can do with all that. So I think it represents a really awesome opportunity to do some additional things.
The first time I read through Operatives Dossier when I was doing Tomes of Magic, the augmented reality idea, it sounded really interesting and I got excited about it, but I had a pretty fuzzy idea of what it really meant. And so, as we prepared for this episode, I pulled up my PDF of Operatives Dossier and I read that section again. And I got the strong impression this time that augmented reality was bringing things from the digital web to Earth, but nothing on Earth gets sent to the digital web. That's what was kind of the clarifying concept for me, was a person on Earth can put on an augmented reality headset and see things in the digital web sort of laid over the place where he is on Earth. But someone in that space in the digital web, they would not see anything from Earth appearing in front of them in the digital web. And so I think that was sort of the key that helped me make more sense of this. And what is interesting to me about this is it seems very plausible that the technocrat leadership would be more remote from the common people. They are more risk averse. There are probably a lot of top level leaders in the technocracy that look at the digital web and say there's a lot of potential there. We want to get a return on our investment, but I'm not going to walk into the digital web. I might get zapped. I'm not an expert there, and there's a lot of risk, and I don't like taking risks. But I want my agents to work on some technology. Let's call it augmented reality, where we can get use of the digital web here on Earth without risking our necks by going to the digital web. And so it's plausible that technocrats would want to develop that technology. And then once it's there, the virtual adepts catch on, all hell breaks loose, and we get interesting stories, as you were telling us.
I think there's a lot of fun potential with augmented reality. One thing I will caution is anyone who's looking at using it might want to take a lot of the rules in that section of Operatives Dossier with a grain of salt. There's a lot of weird, messy stuff. There's a lot of super overpowered things for people logged in via augmented reality. It feels like someone put a new set of characters out for a fighting game and was worried no one was going to want to use them. So they're like, well, let's just make it all really strong and then everyone's going to want to use it. It's so good, which is fine. Except what about all the other things that don't work that way and there's no reason for them to work differently? I don't think that's a huge hurdle. As with Mage, there's always the golden rule, and you can just skip on past those things that don't quite line up and really take the fun stuff and tell some fun stories with it.
The only other thing I wanted to add on augmented reality before we move on was just this idea that when you're using augmented reality, these digital web, they call them AROs, augmented reality object. So these AROs that you're seeing and interacting with, they're on the digital web just like other things are on the digital web. So any AROs that are created, there's a place on the digital web where they're just sitting there. And so mages who go to the digital web, if they know where the AROs are located, they can go in and mess with it. So you could, if you wanted, have two different mage games, two different groups of players for your mage games. One group is on Earth trying to break into a technocrat construct on Earth, and then the other group of mage players are in the digital web, and they are trying to help the group on Earth. So the group on Earth, they're going to get in trouble if the AROs call the guards on them when they're trying to break in. So the players who are mages in the digital web, they have got to find the AROs, knock them out, and support the team on Earth. And so you can have sort of a dual back and forth game like that, and augmented reality opens up possibilities like that. So it's a lot of fun.
I think that opens up some really good heist, especially opportunities where instead of having your elite computer cracker characters sitting in a room by themselves talking to everyone else on the headset and making computer rolls over and over again, they're in their own place doing their own thing, and both sides of the heist are benefiting from the things the others are doing. There's a lot of that back and forth between the two locations playing into each other that would make for some really fun play.
I forgot about that. That's a common problem with the cyberpunk sort of operation. You've got the guys in the heist, they're breaking in, and you've got one guy in a safe, air conditioned place munching potato chips, and he just makes computer rolls. And it's like augmented reality can open it up so you got two teams, they're both doing cool stuff, and they both need each other. Well, does that wrap up the AR section?
Yeah, I'm sure there's all sorts of other things we could come up with, but I think that goes over everything I can think of right now. It's a fun opportunity to try some new stuff with the digital web, and even though it's a little fiddly in its initial write up, it's exciting that there is some newer digital web content out there and new ideas to play around with.
I think Mage fans could really benefit from a sort of a second pass at that augmented reality, a better write up. If we can only find some guys who were good at making Mage SRDs, but I don't know. Some you can't have everything. I'll just have to give up on that one for now. Hint, hint. But the final topic we were going to discuss was one that I was really excited about. James passed me some of his notes, and so at the end of all of his topics, he had one where he just said new ideas. And I thought, James, I want to hear the new ideas. So lay it on us.
This is a pretty big pile of stuff, so I'm going to try to knock through it pretty quick. Some of it we've already talked a bit about it before. One of the things that was really both exciting and upsetting as I read through the digital web books was as I read the early books, I'm like, oh, I have this idea, I have that idea. And then I would get to the later books and be like, oh, here is 90% of that idea that I thought I was so brilliant for having. They have already written it down. But we'll hit on a few of them real quick. So parameters, I've already talked about. That was in the first book and really just kind of got dropped off. I think that bringing parameters back and ones that really defy how things normally work on Earth or allow or require specific icons are going to make the digital web a very interesting and unique place. Going to the Umbra and going to the digital web can feel very similar, but it's very different if you are a bird or a fish or a dragon when you get where you're going and interact with an environment that's customized to being that type of thing. I think icons really need to have a little more capacity. If you make a dragon and code in the ability for it to breathe fire, then you should be able to breathe fire without having to bust out a forces effect. But that does increase the upkeep for a storyteller a little. They need to be ready for that or have locations that are prepared for that sort of chaos, or at least thematic concept.
Yeah, maybe when you roll to make an icon, if you get more successes than this, then each success becomes a slot, and you can fill that slot with improvement to a skill or breathe fire or something like that.
Mhm.
Just ideas, but for now, let's move on.
I think holistic immersion should really get the opportunity to benefit from icons themselves. That layer of extra safety from having it. And I think the risk of them being there can still be introduced. There's still ways to strip away that icon and threaten them directly, but there should be some sort of payoff to putting themselves in such a dangerous situation beyond you get to use your normal physical stats. One of the concepts from Digital Web 2.0 that I really enjoyed and that just to me screamed this is a thing you can just do on the internet was the idea of parallaxing, where you could be in multiple places and be multiple icons at once. Obviously, there's going to be a fairly high tax on your character mentally to maintain all of those at the same time, but it's something you can do on modern browsers. I currently have, actually, I don't want to say how many tabs I have open on my computer because once you get past 100, it gets a little embarrassing. But
How many episodes are you recording simultaneously? Just tell me that.
just the one. I don't have the wit score to make more than one happen, I'm afraid. One idea that gets brought up a couple times in the fiction and never is brought up as a rule is the idea of personal bubbles or shells around your character, which
Mm.
makes a lot of sense. There is sort of this space between you and all the things you're interacting with, and it sort of plays into modern ideas like encrypted chats or VPNs. So the idea that there is a small bubble or area around you that you have an increased amount of control or extra safety within makes a lot of sense. Being able to say, encrypt your bubble so that someone fires a weapon at you and their shot gets scrambled is a cool concept. They're similar to being in through a VPN and that protecting you, or using HTTPS to verify where you actually are on the internet. It makes it so that you have a little more control over your interaction. And I think the more conveniences the internet has that the digital web should have, we need to pull some of those in. Virtual wait from the first digital web book was another one I really loved. There's should
Yeah, that was cool.
It makes a lot of sense because there's only so much storage space on your hard drive. There's only so much storage space in your mind. If you're grabbing boatloads of data, it really makes sense to have some sort of capacity of how much you can steal. And that balancing act of searching for exactly what you want versus the speed of stealing everything in one big chunk, it's a lot of fun. But having some sort of cap on it via digital weight makes a lot of sense. Having digital web space inside of a computer. So it gets mentioned a couple times throughout the books of either Turing's first experiment being this small single digital web room, or the virtual adept in the revised tradition book popping off of the digital web but being still an icon inside of their computer's storage space, which appears like a warehouse full of crates that are all of their files. It's a lot of fun ideas. I'm sure a lot of us watched Reboot back in the 90s, and I sure loved it. So the concept that there's an entire digital world inside of your computer is just a really fun one you can explore via the digital web. If we get into a handful of more things that I came up with and didn't just happen to align with the books on, there is the concept I came up with of crypto rot. So the idea that the resources being used up in the real world by cryptocurrency mining and AI overuse, this huge drain on available resources, is going to result in this wasting virus on the digital web. The digital web requires a ton of quintessence to maintain it, that's usually pulled in via the sleepers who are online and using it. And if that's all being sucked away by Bitcoin mining, chatbots, AI art programs, then you're going to see the digital web have a hard time maintaining itself. We talked about hot links and popping, and one of the things that I felt was really missing from the digital web is, what about bookmarks? When I go to a website and I want to find that website again easily, I create a bookmark and then I click on the bookmark and I go there right away. And I thought it would make a lot of sense for characters to be able to have essentially a personal set of hot links that they've built, and potentially even the ability to load specific icons for those locations that let them just tap on the bookmark and go there right away. It's how we use the internet. So it's again that idea of bringing in concepts from the modern internet and porting them to the digital web.
But what about if your nemesis and rival gets onto the digital web while you're taking a vacation with your girlfriend, finds your bookmark, moves it somewhere else, and then does some, digital coding there to make it look like it was not moved? Is that a possibility?
I love that. The idea of someone changing where your bookmarks point to, or a redirect being set up to capture you on the way there and send you somewhere else. Yeah, I think that would be fantastic and make for an interesting story in that suddenly you're somewhere you don't expect to be. How do you get out, or do you just log out?
Yeah, I would say you would need to succeed on a rote to even see the bookmarks that other people left there, because a
Mm.
lot of the people who come to the digital web will not have that level of savvy. So they'll walk by a bunch of bookmarks and not realize that they were there. But the people who have more skill and experience, they've got a rote for. Are there any bookmarks here? Aha, there's a bookmark. Now, who left it? Oh, that guy. I hate that guy. I'm going to mess with him.
And that's something we see in video games, which is sort of that idea of phased or local only content, where one user can see it because it's turned on for them. No one else can see it or even necessarily knows it's there because it's turned off for them. But in the digital web, with the capacity, and especially with sphere magic, that ability to look for things that are otherwise invisible or unknown really opens up the chance to find and play with things like that other people have built. Algorithmic sectors. So, one of the things it gets kind of touched on in one of the adventures in the original digital web book, in that you could have a room that transforms each time you come into it. So you only have a single room, but as you walk out one door and walk back into the room, it reconfigures itself. Sort of building on that idea, space is very loosely defined within the digital web. So you could potentially have a sector that is relatively small, but what exists within there is based on an algorithm. The same way that procedural content for roguelikes work, that content for Minecraft works, where all of what's in there is based on a set of rules and unfolds around you as you travel through it, rather than having to constantly exist and take up all that space. There's a really brilliant story called The Library of Babel that is this gargantuan dimension of sets of books. And it's something that building out a physical space like that is completely infeasible for the amount of data it would take up. But the structure could entirely be built from an algorithm that lets you move through it, and it all exists, but within this code rather than all of the data actually being fully defined out. The last two things I really want to touch on. One of the things I really thought was lacking from all the digital web write ups I saw were the idea of whiteout proofing. So there's the risk of getting too much paradox and bringing down an entire sector. And with the Great Crash, you have this idea that sectors were so affected by a giant scale whiteout that they are ruined forever. And this is what really turned the virtual adepts from, we should move to reality 2.0 to, whoa, wait, the digital web isn't reality 2.0. It's our testing ground for reality 2.0. And we can do cool things there and then backport them to reality and find ways to take this digital web magic, make it work in meat space, and really bring these cool concepts back home. But if you could make sectors that are self sustaining, that are immune to whiteout crashes, that are able to maintain even if there's another great crash, now you've got a location that's more on par with the Umbra, somewhere you truly can go to and hide out and be, which I think searching for a way to do that would be incredible fodder for a chronicle and a really fun idea to play around with. Last one, there is a brief mention in one of the rumors pages of the concept of an online faction potentially forming that's the virtual adepts and void engineers teaming up. And I think that's something that the digital web really misses out on. With the Umbra, it's so heavily used by the mages and less so by the technocrats in some ways, depending on constructs, things out that the void engineers are playing with. But with the digital web, no one's really taken any ownership or direct interest in maintaining this realm. And I thought it would be really fun to, in fact, have the virtual adepts, or at least a giant chunk of them, the void engineers, and potentially even some of the native residents of the digital web, those awakened avatar imbued AIs, decide that they're really tired of what the sleepers are doing, what even the other mages are doing, and form a faction. Fractal Architects is the title that was mentioned in Digital Web 2.0. I thought about taking the easy route and just virtual engineers, virtual adepts, void engineers. I'd like to think myself a somewhat creative person, but not all the time, clearly.
It's hard to name things. Don't feel bad.
Yeah, but having a group that really wants to protect the web, that is the wardens of the web, that's also a pretty good name. But having a group that really wants to protect this place and the possibility it represents would make for a fun meta plot shift, would make for something that you can really bounce off of and sink your teeth into if you're placing a chronicle within here.
Now that we are nearing the end, I found three listener questions. There were a lot of good ones, but I had to whittle it down to around three and wanted to just put those to my guest and see what kind of answers we can work on. TL Web asks, how would you help a player that is struggling to think of an icon in the digital web?
That's a really fun question because there's obviously a very easy answer. You give that character a button they can just slam on, and it makes an icon that looks just like them. It's their self image, it's It's them on the internet. Another easy answer that I think is a little more fun is you send them to a sector that has really strong restrictions, a very constrained theme. So they don't need to worry about the exact nuances of their icon because they're going to this fantasy sector. They need to look like a knight or a wizard or something that would fit in appropriately. You can also give them a pre-built set of icons. That's one of the things they talk about a few times in the book. So some options that are just, here's a thing you can look like when you go online. And as always, this is something I always do with my players when they're having a hard time coming up with something. I just sit down with them and talk it out for a bit, get them really try to think not just what they're interested in, but what their character would be interested in. And it could help them find something they really enjoy. And the nice thing about this is it's the digital web. So if they hate their initial answer and they build an icon they absolutely despise, even in the middle of another scene, they can just load up a new icon. You don't have to retcon anything. They don't have to have always looked that way and we changed our mind. It's the digital web. It's all up for grabs all the time. So you just change the way you look.
Well, we've got a question from Faust. What elements or themes of the digital web might be outdated but could still be fun in a contemporary game of Mage?
We talked about virtual wait before, and as much as I love it, it is a little outdated in the sense that absolutely enormous files aren't really a big concern anymore. Having a handful of terabytes on your computer is no big deal. So the idea of grabbing a giant chunk of data isn't a big problem like it would have been in older versions. That being said, it's still a really fun idea to play around with, and constraining what a character can grab or handle versus taking the time to find the needle in the haystack that they're actually looking for is a fun way to play around with that, to put limitations on it. I keep beating on the holistic immersion drum, and it feels like a holdover from Tron. It feels old and it doesn't feel like it necessarily embraces the way modern technology works. It's much more of a fantasy idea. But that being said, the whole when you die in the game, you die in real life, as silly as that concept is, it's a fun concept. Forcing the players to go in via holistic immersion is a fun way to keep it dangerous and interesting and a scary, weird place instead of just, I'm looking at a 3D web page.
Yeah, it lets a storyteller approach the digital web in possibly two different ways. The first is, hey, you're astrally immersed. This is the opportunity for you to cut loose and do some wild things, and it's justified in the game. And then we'll take you back to New Jersey, where everything is very, high risk and there's paradox everywhere. The other side of that is they could be infiltrating the lair of an enemy, and the enemy springs a trap and says, "Ha ha! I have transferred you all holistically into the digital web. Now you're in trouble. Now you're bringing your players into the digital web, but it's high stakes, it's high risk. They want to get it right or they're in trouble. And that's a different kind of a game. And we can do both in the digital web."
I think there's a lot of fun ways to play with that. The last outdated concept you mentioned earlier is that sort of digital web culture, the slang in the books especially. There's a lot of silly and absurd terms. I love the term hamburger country so much. I love Hebo or Hebe as a way to refer to the young upstart kids that don't really get how it works. Flipping through those lexicons and pulling out some of the slang is a great way to instantly give tons of personality to those terminally online NPCs that your player characters are interacting with. It makes the digital web feel like its own unique place with its own unique culture in exchange for getting to say some silly words.
In a sense, I feel like it's kind of justified because with the internet nowadays, it's like whether it's a smartphone or a laptop or whatever. I mean, you can be using it, but you turn your head and you talk with the guy next to you, and then you go back to using it, and then you drop it and help your wife with something, and on and on. It's like you're pinging back and forth, and it's a part of our everyday life, and it's no big deal, you could say. But when you log into the digital web, you are all there, and you don't just lift the headset off your head and you're back in your living room. It's if you're really in there, the astral immersion, it's not that simple. And so it does feel like a different place where everything is different. And so saying that a different subculture exists there, it kind of makes sense to me. I can justify that as a storyteller without feeling self conscious. So that is a possibility. But we did have one final question. Every Night K Night asks, how does current technology such as search engines, large language models, etc., interact with the digital web?
It's kind of a tough question because the digital web books make it very clear the overlap between the actual internet and the digital web is small. There's some in grid space or the grid sectors, but by and large, the two aren't touching each other a ton. And because the digital web, especially in some of its iterations, works a lot like the Umbra, more so than the internet, it doesn't line up quite right. But that's a bad answer. That's ignoring the question. So we're gonna dig into some of those ideas and how they work. Search engines are a tough one, honestly, because the digital web consists of these closed sectors that are interconnected via conduits, whatever the nature of conduits is. So a search engine typically is going to be powered by something that crawls around the web and builds up a data on where all of that is, but that's a lot harder when you have these closed sectors that aren't physically located in sensible ways compared to each other. But why not have something that does that? Have a weird virtual adept that hangs out in their digital sanctum, builds digital entities to crawl through these voids between the sectors, find them, scan them from the outside, possibly using powerful effects to really peer in there even when it's restricted and shouldn't be accessible, and then report those findings back. So now you have someone with this giant repository that the characters could go to and say, hey, I need to run a search. I want to look up this piece of information or find out where on the digital web people have interacted with this thing. And not only do you have a way to find those things, some interesting places to send your characters to, but also someone that they're, because of the amount of work involved in building up this data, they might owe a favor to in order to get these search results. So there's a lot of fun you can have with that. For the LLMs, chatbots, all that kind of stuff, I think a lot of the things they can do are already covered better by actual digital web things. Chatbots are a lot less interesting when you have truly thinking AIs with awakened avatars. But there is some interesting stuff you can play with, such as the huge drain on the resources around them that I mentioned earlier with the crypto rot, that concept. Sleepers building these programs that are getting too big, too powerful. They hop the fence out of the grid sectors, and now these energy consuming concepts are floating around the digital web, draining sectors of their energy sources, causing whiteouts and crashes. They seem like they're intelligent, they seem like they can be reasoned with, but they are mindless predictive text monsters gobbling up resources. And you can't convince them with mind because they don't necessarily have one. But at the same time, it can tell you, no, please don't harm me. It's a fun, interesting concept to play with and see how the players decide to deal with something like that. For anything online in the real world, you can adapt it to the digital web and potentially take it a fun and unpredictable direction. I won't lie, I spent so much time immersed in the digital web books and really thinking through how all those things worked. I didn't really take a lot of the real world internet concepts and consider how those would work in the digital web, what you could do with them. So if you or anyone listening to this has some more thoughts, suggestions, things they want to see explored in the digital web, please hit me up on the Mage the Podcast Discord, because I would really love to work through more of these ideas. I'm just, for whatever reason, drawing an absolute blank on what some of them might be.
And people are going to find you as J question mark there.
Yes.
That's the guy. So yeah, join us on the Mage Discord. J question mark and I are both there, and we love to talk. And there's a lot more about the digital web that can be covered. And in the days ahead, we may have the opportunity to revisit that and bring you some more. But for now, I think we've covered our topics, and I think we've given our listeners a few ideas to chew on about the digital web and how they might get these different Mage texts and work them together into an engaging environment that they can offer their players in an actual game. So thanks, James, for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope our listeners get something out of this and continue the conversations online.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real honor to be on here. Mage, the podcast, has really brought me back to tabletop role playing games in the last year or so since I started really diving into the back episodes and listening to the current ones. And it's really, really exciting to be here and talk about these things with you and have other people hear my weird rantings on the digital web and the aspects of it.
Well, I'm glad you got something out of the podcast. And what I am really glad about is that for our listeners, you are returning the favor, something I always love to see. If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and Threads. The links are in the show notes. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes. We have a YouTube channel now where you can find our episodes. There's a link in the show notes, but you can also search YouTube for Mage the Podcast. You'll find us. This episode was assisted greatly by our executive producers, and I want to thank them now. Oracle Derek Semsick, Oracle Drunk Des, Oracle Jason Vines, Oracle Drawncap, Oracle Sean Gallagher, Oracle The Crew of Erebus, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Guy Stewart, Oracle Buck Gregory, Oracle Bad Company, Oracle Rebecca P., Oracle Spartacus, Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Jeff Wah, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aaron, Archmaster Wolf Larison, Bruno Texeira, Ben Bandelo, Jade Barrett, Morris Hopkins, James B., Jervis Johnson, EBG, George Lara, Will Vincent, Shartan, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Lauren Jensen, Tyler Bryan, Sev Nessus, Bubba the Pale One, Eric Schwenk, Starfish, Ambiversion, Ryan Stray, Lols and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Alexia, Patrick McNamara, Blaze Hibbert, Daniel Scribner, Rob H., Ryan, Alex, Nikita Klaimanov, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Andres S., Bryce Perry, Michael Parker, Jeremy Z., Melissa Krause, Ian Robertson, Curtis Hendricks, Sig, Manel Canos, Darren Hennessy, David Rowe, Jason Kennedy, Samuel Tobin, Nabero, Jenna F., Chris Kinner, Gray Trilug H., Daniel Cuppen, Ryan Kendi, Ia Bull, Stephen Carton. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.